Ilara knelt in the dust and let the chickens into her dying wheat. The townsfolk of Promise Creek, what few were watching from the road, agreed she had finally surrendered her senses. 200 birds, a frantic, feathered river of reds and whites and speckled grays, poured through the gate she held open. They surged into the stunted, yellowing stalks with a chorus of excited clucks and greedy squawks, a sound of misplaced jubilation. The wheat was a failure, scorched by a dry spring before it ever had a chance to fill out. Any other farmer would have cut it for scant fodder or plowed it under in disgust. Ilara was feeding it to chickens. Silas Croft, the grain merchant, had said it best a week prior, leaning against the counter of his store, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "That girl's plowing her field with beaks. She'll be begging for credit by first frost, mark me." A low chuckle had moved through the assembled men. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was the sound of weary certainty. They knew what worked and what didn't, and a lone woman trying to raise a ridiculous number of birds on a patch of failed land was a story that had only one ending. Ilara heard the judgment in the silence from the road, in the way a passing wagon didn't slow. She felt it like the sun on the back of her neck. But she watched her flock, her foolish, expensive flock, and saw something else. They were not pecking at the withered grain. They were stabbing at the leaves, at the stalks, their heads darting with a fierce, focused energy. They were eating the future. She let the gate swing shut behind the last straggling hen, the wood groaning in the heat. She had done the arithmetic in the dark, night after night. The cost of the feed, the price of a dozen eggs, the days until winter. The numbers never balanced. Now she was throwing out the ledger and betting on this single mad act. 3 months earlier, she had been a different kind of fool. She'd stood before a traveling peddler, his wagon cages crammed with the same birds, and listened to his pitch. Her father's passing had left her with the deed to 40 acres of stubborn clay and a small, cracked leather pouch of coins that felt lighter every time she touched it. The peddler saw the hunger in her eyes, the thinness of her dress. "Best layers you'll find this side of the mountains, miss. Hardy stock. Foragers, every one." The men of Promise Creek bought seed, mules, sturdy plows. They invested in things that were solid, predictable. Ilara looked at the nervous, bright-eyed birds, and she saw 200 small, feathered hearts beating against the coming winter. She saw motion and life. She handed the peddler almost everything she had. The sight of her herding her new flock down the town's main street had been a piece of theater. Children pointed. Women shook their heads from behind lace curtains. 200 mouths to feed, someone muttered. She's bought herself 200 holes in her pocket. She had felt their pity like a physical weight, but she had kept her head high, herding her clucking, chaotic fortune home. The first month was a lesson in the brutal arithmetic of survival. 200 chickens ate a staggering amount of grain. Ilara had spent her last coins on a few sacks from Silas Croft's store, and the sight of the burlap draining away each day was a knot of fear in her stomach. She rose before the sun, her hands raw from hauling water and mixing mash, and went to bed long after dark, the scent of dust and feathers clinging to her hair. Every morning, she did the math. 200 birds, requiring so many pounds of feed, producing, for now, almost nothing. They were young, not yet in full lay. The equation was simple: bankruptcy by August. The townsfolk treated her with a kind of gentle, pitying distance. They would nod as she passed, their eyes lingering on her worn dress and the smudges of dirt on her cheek. Their wives would sometimes offer a slice of pie or a jar of preserves, gestures of charity for the soon-to-be destitute. No one ever asked about the chickens. It was like inquiring after a terminal illness, a matter of politeness to ignore the obvious folly. Silas Croft was the only one who spoke of it directly. He rode out to her farm one afternoon, his horse a fine, glossy chestnut that stood in stark contrast to her dusty yard. He dismounted, keeping his gloves on, and surveyed the sprawling, clucking chaos of her flock. "Miss Alara," he began, his voice a smooth balm of false concern. "A place like this, it's a lot for a young woman to handle on her own." He gestured toward the coops she had been painstakingly repairing. "This is a man's work, a family's work." She said nothing, her stillness a wall against his condescension. "I'm a practical man," he continued, turning his gaze to her fields, "and a friend to your late father. I'd be willing to take this land off your hands, give you a fair price, enough to see you settled somewhere more suitable, a room in town perhaps." His version of a fair price, she knew, would be just enough to make her dependent. His offer was not a kindness, it was a hook. "I'm not selling, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice flat. He smiled, a tight, knowing little smile. "Of course, a person has their pride, but pride doesn't fill a belly in January. My offer stands. When you see reason, you know where to find me." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the scent of leather and smug certainty in the air. One person, alone. The words echoed in the quiet of the yard. It was what they all thought. It was what she feared in the dead of night, when the numbers scrolled behind her eyes. That evening, she collected only 3 eggs. She held them in her palm. They were small and fragile, a pathetic return on an investment of everything she had. She did not despair. She adjusted. The next morning, she reduced the grain ration by 1/4 and began letting the flock range farther, herding them along the margins of her property, near the creek bed and the scraggly woods, forcing them to learn the other half of the peddler's promise. Foragers, every one. By June, the heat had settled in for good. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, empty of clouds for weeks at a time. Her small plot of spring wheat, which should have been a vibrant green, was a sickly yellow-green, the stalks thin and stunted. It was thirsty, and the creek was already dropping. Another failed equation. But Alara, spending her days walking the edges of her land, began to see a different economy at work, one the men on their plows never noticed. She saw it in the way the chickens ignored the easy forage in the pasture and instead clustered along the wheat field's edge, their heads darting, their focus absolute. One afternoon, she knelt down among the pathetic stalks, parting the leaves. The underside was crawling with tiny black specks, no bigger than a grain of pepper. She looked closer. They had legs. They moved. Grasshopper nymphs. A whole generation, hatched in the dry warmth, quietly feasting on her dying crop. They were invisible from the road, a secret plague known only to her and the birds. It was then that Old Man Hemlock paid her a visit. He was her nearest neighbor, a quiet, stooped man from some forgotten corner of the old country who farmed a small, immaculate plot of vegetables. The town regarded him with the same suspicion they held for anything that didn't conform, but his silence was comfortable, not judgmental. He didn't ride a fine horse. He simply appeared at her fence line one day, holding a basket of perfect, deep red tomatoes. He watched her chickens for a long time, his eyes missing nothing. "They are good workers," he said finally, his voice raspy, accented. He didn't say she was a fool. He didn't offer pity. He just watched. "The wheat is failing," Alara stated, a fact as plain as the dust on her boots. Hemlock nodded, his gaze fixed on a hen that had just snatched a nymph from a leaf. "The land always gives something back," he said, his voice soft but clear. "You must only learn what it wants to give." He handed her the basket of tomatoes over the fence. A gift for a gift. She didn't understand. What gift? He smiled, a slow, wrinkled unfolding. You have quieted the grass. Soon the real singers will come. Your birds will be ready for them. He turned and walked away, leaving her with the weight of his words and the sweet, earthy smell of the tomatoes. That evening, a boy appeared. He was small for his age, maybe 10, with a shock of unruly blonde hair and clothes that were clean but patched. His name was Finn. He didn't say much, just stood at the edge of the yard, watching the chickens as if they were the most fascinating spectacle on earth. Ilara, accustomed to being watched with pity, found his open curiosity unnerving at first. But he kept coming back, day after day, sitting on the fence rail in silent observation. One afternoon, he pointed to a big, bossy Rhode Island red. "That one's the general," he announced. It was the first time he'd spoken more than a single word to her. And so began the naming of the flock, a project Finn took on with solemn dedication. There was Pip, Patches, a cranky hen named Mrs. Gable, and a dozen others. His quiet presence was a strange comfort, a small anchor against the town's collective doubt. The decision crystallized on a blisteringly hot afternoon in late June. The wheat was no longer just dying, it was dead, brittle stalks bleached pale by the sun. It was worthless, a monument to her failure. From the road, it was a field of ruin, but up close, Ilara saw it was teeming with life. The pepper-specked nymphs had grown. They were still small, but now they were recognizably grasshoppers, hopping and chewing with silent, relentless industry. Another week, and they would have wings. Another week, and they would be gone, flying off to join the larger swarms the old-timers were starting to mutter about. The land always gives something back. Hemlock's words returned to her. The land was giving her a harvest, just not the one she had planted. It was a harvest of protein, of insect life, a feast waiting to be taken. The arithmetic shifted in her mind. It was no longer about saving the wheat. It was about converting the plague into sustenance. That evening, she stood by the gate to the wheat field, her hand resting on the weathered wood. The chorus of mockery played in her memory, plowing her field with beaks. The image of Silas Croft's smug, pitying face, a woman alone. The fear was a cold stone in her gut. If she was wrong, she would be stripping her field of the last of its miserable fodder for nothing. She would be the town's cautionary tale for a generation. But if she was right, she looked at her flock, now gathered near the gate, sensing her purpose. They were lean and tough from a month of foraging, but they were healthy. She saw the general, bossing his way to the front. She saw Pip and Patches. She saw 200 hungry, efficient engines of conversion. She thought of Old Man Hemlock's quiet confidence and Finn's simple, trusting presence. She was alone, but perhaps not entirely. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and dry grass, she lifted the latch. The scene unfolded just as it had in the cold open of her fears, but this time it was imbued with purpose. The river of chickens poured into the field, a frantic, feathered tide. But now she saw the precision in their chaos. They weren't just running, they were hunting. They tore through the brittle wheat, not for the grain, but for the insects clinging to every stalk. The sound was a frenzied percussion of pecking and fluttering. Finn, who had been watching from his perch on the fence, scrambled down and ran to her side, his eyes wide with awe. "Look!" he shouted over the din. "They're eating the bugs!" He, at least, understood. Together, they spent the afternoon herding the flock, moving them in sections through the field, ensuring an even devastation. The news traveled fast. A rider heading to the next town over saw the spectacle and carried the tale with him. By evening, it was all over Promise Creek. Alara was not just a fool, she was now officially mad. She was destroying her own crop out of spite or despair. The laughter in Croft's store that night was louder, less tinged with pity and more with derision. It was easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. For a week, the flock lived in the wheat field. Every morning, Alara and Finn would open the gate, and every evening they would herd the birds back into the safety of their coop. The field was systematically stripped, stalk by stalk, until it was little more than a patch of broken stubble. To the outside world, it was an act of agricultural suicide. For Alara, it was a gamble paying its first secret dividends. The chickens changed. Their foraging had kept them lean, but this new diet, rich in protein, began to transform them. Their feathers took on a deeper sheen. They moved with a new weight, a new solidity. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. And then came the eggs. It started slowly. A dozen one day, then 2, then 4. But the numbers kept climbing. She had done the arithmetic of a grain-fed flock, but she had never imagined the arithmetic of a plague-fed one. The eggs themselves were different. They were larger than before, the shells thick and strong, and the yolks. When she cracked the first one into a hot skillet, she gasped. It was not the pale yellow of a store-bought egg. It was a deep, vibrant gold, the color of a sunset. It was the color of pure, concentrated life. It tasted rich and clean, like the essence of sunshine itself. It was the taste of being right. This, she knew, was a secret to be kept. Hunger changes a town, but envy changes it faster. She began collecting the eggs in baskets, dozens and dozens a day. She filled every crock and jar she owned, preserving them in water glass, a solution of sodium silicate that would keep them fresh for months. Her cellar, once a cool, empty space of dirt and shadows, began to fill with the pale, luminous globes of stored eggs. It was her treasure, her insurance, banked like a coal low under ash. She sold only what she had to, a few dozen here and there, enough to buy flour and salt and oil. She told no one of the true number. The arithmetic had finally tipped in her favor. The cost of the feed was now 0. The income was small, but the asset accumulating in her cellar was growing at an astonishing rate. One evening, Finn helped her count, basket after basket, jar after jar. "There's hundreds, Alara," he whispered, his voice full of reverence. "Maybe 1,000. He looked at her, his young face serious. "You're not a fool. You're rich." She put a finger to her lips, a smile touching her face for what felt like the first time in months. It was a private victory, sweeter for being shared only with a boy who had believed in the general and a flock of mad hens. Being right is its own kind of reply, but for now, it was a reply she made only to herself. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The heat was relentless, the sun a white fire in a hazy sky. The whispers about the grasshoppers grew louder. They were massing in the dry hills to the west, great armies of them. The town of Promise Creek held its breath. It was during this tense waiting time that the first outsider tasted Alara's secret. A government survey crew, charting a new railroad line, camped for a few days by the creek. Their cook was a harried, sweat-stained man named Miller, tired of bacon and beans. He heard a rumor in town of a woman with a few eggs to sell and rode out to her farm, expecting little. Alara met him at the gate, her hands dusty, her face guarded. "Heard you might have a dozen to spare," he said, mopping his brow with a bandana. She sold him 24, taking his coins with a nod. She watched him ride away, a familiar knot of anxiety in her chest. An hour later he was back, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust. He half fell out of the saddle, his face flushed with excitement. "Lady," he stammered, holding up one of the eggs, "in all my years I've never seen a yolk that color, never tasted an egg like that. What in God's name are you feeding these birds?" Alara just looked at him. "They forage," she said. It was the truth, if not the whole truth. "Forage?" he scoffed. "They must be foraging for solid gold. I'll buy every egg you have. Name your price." He was a city man, used to haggling, to assuming a seller would start high. Ilara looked at his earnest, hungry face. She thought of the jars in her cellar. She named a price. It was twice what she'd been getting in town, but only half what he seemed willing to pay. It was a fair price. He stared at her for a second, then let out a bark of laughter. "Sold," he said, pulling a worn purse from his coat. He bought 10 dozen, carefully packing them in a crate with straw she provided. "We're here for 3 more days. I'll be back tomorrow. Don't you sell any of these to anyone else." The interaction changed something. It wasn't just her own belief now, or Finn's, or Old Man Hemlock's quiet nod. It was proof, weighed and paid for in silver. It was a thing's only worth what others will pay, and a stranger had just paid handsomely. The cook, true to his word, became a daily customer, his praise for the eggs echoing back into town with the men who came in for supplies. The women who had pitied Alara now looked at her with a new expression, curiosity tinged with envy. The men in Croft's store fell silent when she entered. The mockery had stopped. It was replaced by a watchful, calculating quiet. Silas Croft himself felt the shift. He heard the talk of the survey cook. He saw the way Alara now walked, her shoulders a little less hunched, her gaze direct. Pity was a tool he understood. This new quiet confidence was a threat. His offers to buy her out had been based on her presumed failure. Now he had to reconsider his approach. Her land, with its access to the dwindling creek, was more valuable than ever in this dry year. And if she had stumbled into some bizarre form of profit, that profit belonged, by the natural order of things, to a man like him. His gaze was no longer condescending. It was the cool, appraising look of a wolf measuring a sheep that had, impossibly, grown claws. The sky began to change. The usual pale, endless blue was tinged with a brownish-yellow haze at the western horizon. The air grew heavy, unnaturally still, and carried a faint, dry, clicking sound, like 1,000 tiny gears turning at once. Old Man Hemlock stopped by her fence again, not with a gift this time, but with a worried look. He crumbled a bit of the dry soil from her yard between his fingers. "The singers are coming," he said, his voice low. He scanned the sky. "Big ones. Lock up your birds." The signs were all there, for those who knew how to read them. The frantic activity of ants building their hills higher. The way the creek, already low, seemed to sink into its bed overnight, leaving damp, cracked mud where water had been the day before. The birds of the air fell silent. A deep, listening quiet fell over the land. Promise Creek was a town built on the gamble of the sky and the soil, and it knew the signs of a losing hand. Panic began as a low murmur and grew into a frantic scuttling. Men rushed to harvest what they could from their own scorched fields, knowing it was too little, too late. Women worked to seal any cracks in their homes, stuffing rags under doors. The sound of hammering echoed through the valley as farmers tried to reinforce their barns. Silas Croft stood on the porch of his store, watching the activity with a grim satisfaction. His granary was full, the doors barred with new iron locks. Scarcity, for him, was just another word for opportunity. Alara felt the coming storm not with panic, but with a cold, clear focus. This was the second half of the equation she had calculated in her mind. The chickens had feasted on the vanguard. Now the main army was coming. She and Finn worked for 2 days straight. They reinforced the coop, patching every hole, sealing every crack. They hauled water from the creek, filling every barrel and trough they possessed, knowing the grasshoppers would foul whatever was left. They gathered the last of the eggs, adding them to the silent, growing treasure in the cellar. On the final afternoon, the hum from the west was no longer faint. It was a palpable vibration in the air, a deep, ominous thrum that you felt in your teeth. The brownish haze had become a roiling, dirty cloud that swallowed the sun, casting the valley in a sickly twilight. Alara and Finn herded the last of the chickens into the coop. The birds were restless, sensing the wrongness in the air, but they went. Alara barred the door, her heart pounding in time with the growing hum. Finn looked at her, his face pale in the strange light. "Will we be all right?" he asked, his voice a small thing in the face of the enormous sound. "We will," Alara said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We ate the plague before it could eat us." She looked out at her field of stubble, the field everyone had mocked. It was a firebreak, a buffer. There was nothing left for them to eat. Her gaze went to the neighboring farms, to the fields of corn and late alfalfa, still holding the promise of a meager harvest. That promise was about to be broken. The swarm arrived not as a wave, but as a suffocating blanket. The world outside Alara's small cabin was reduced to a single, deafening, clicking roar and a churning brown darkness. It was a living storm, a hurricane of mandibles and wings. They blotted out the sun completely, turning midday into a deep, horrifying twilight. They coated every surface, a thick, crawling, writhing carpet of bodies. Through the single window of her cabin, which she and Finn had covered with a heavy quilt, the sound was still overwhelming. It was the sound of millions of tiny mouths chewing the world away. They stayed for a day and a night. The cabin was an island in a sea of devouring life. Alara and Finn sat in the dim lamplight, speaking little. There was nothing to say. They could only listen to the sound of Promise Creek's entire future being consumed. Alara thought of the faces of the men in Croft's store, their smug certainty. She thought of their fields, their gardens, the product of a year's hard labor. It was all turning to dust and ruin, just a few hundred yards away. There was no triumph in it, only a grim, hollow ache. The morning of the second day, the sound began to recede. By noon, it was gone. An unnatural silence fell, deeper and more profound than the quiet that had preceded the swarm. Alara pushed the quilt away from the window and looked out. She had thought she was prepared, but the reality was a shock that stole her breath. The world was gone. Everything green had vanished. Her neighbor's cornfield was a plain of gnawed-off stalks. The lush pastures along the creek were bare dirt. The trees on the hillsides were stripped of their leaves, their branches skeletal against the pale sky. The land was scoured, blasted, as if by fire. Even the paint on her own cabin walls was chewed and pitted. She unbarred the door and stepped outside. The ground crunched under her boots. It was covered in a thick layer of droppings and the husks of dead grasshoppers. The air smelled foul, acidic. Finn followed her out, his face a mask of disbelief. "It's all gone," he whispered. They walked to the chicken coop. The building was battered, the wood scarred, but it was intact. Alara lifted the bar and opened the door. The chickens, after a moment of blinking in the strange, naked light, poured out. They were agitated but unharmed. They began to peck at the dead grasshoppers littering the ground. Another unexpected harvest. Later that day, the people of Promise Creek emerged from their homes. They wandered through their ruined fields like ghosts, their faces blank with shock. Years of work, erased in hours. Their own small flocks of chickens and their milk cows began to cry with hunger. Silas Croft's granary remained locked, a fortress of plenty in a land of famine. He knew his moment was coming. Alara walked to her cellar, Finn at her side. She lifted the trap door. In the cool, quiet dark, the jars of eggs gleamed, a constellation of pale stars. It was not a treasure of money. It was a treasure of tomorrows. Hunger is a patient predator. For the first few days, the shock was too great. The people of Promise Creek moved through the wreckage of their lives in a daze. Then, the gnawing in their bellies began. The small stores of flour and bacon dwindled. The milk cows with no pasture began to go dry. The thin chickens they owned stopped laying entirely. The silence of the valley was broken by the lowing of hungry cattle and the worried murmurs of hungry people. Silas Croft opened his doors. The prices he had posted on the chalkboard were double what they had been a week before. For those with no money, he offered credit against their land deeds. It was a slow, legal annexation of the entire valley. Then, the first person came to Alara's gate. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman whose hen Finn had named in jest. Her face was pinched with worry, her pride a visible, painful burden. "Miss Alara," she started, not meeting her eyes, they say you have eggs to sell." Alara looked at the woman who had once shaken her head at her folly. She saw no triumph, only a neighbor in need. "I have a few," she said quietly. She sold her a dozen for the old price, the fair price. The news spread through the town like wildfire. Alara has eggs. By evening, a small crowd had gathered at her fence line, their faces a mixture of hope and shame. They were the same people who had laughed, who had pitied, who had judged. Now they stood before her, their hats in their hands. This was the moment of reckoning. She could have become Croft. She could have named any price, collected their last coins, taken liens on their tools and their land. The power was hers. She saw Finn watching her from the porch, his expression tense. He was seeing what kind of person she would choose to be. Just as she was about to speak, Silas Croft rode up, his fine horse looking strangely out of place in the ruined landscape. He dismounted, pushing his way through the small crowd. "Alara," he said, his voice loud and commanding, as if taking charge. "This is a difficult situation. These people are desperate. You can't handle this alone." He turned to the crowd. "Go home. I will make an arrangement with Miss Alara. I will buy her entire stock and distribute it fairly." He turned back to her, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'll give you a generous price for the flock and every egg you have, a price no one else could match. Take the money and you can be somewhere warm and safe by winter." It was the final move. He would control the valley's only food source. He would be king. Alara looked from his smooth, confident face to the anxious, hungry faces of her neighbors. She looked at Mrs. Gable, clutching her dozen eggs like a miracle. She took a deep breath. "There will be no arrangement, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet air. "My eggs are not for sale to you." A gasp went through the crowd. Croft's face tightened. "Don't be a fool, girl. You can't manage this supply. It will be chaos. Someone will rob you blind." "I don't think so," Alara said, her gaze steady. She turned to the townsfolk. The price for a dozen eggs is what it has always been. If you have no coin, I will trade. For a day's labor repairing fences, for winter wood, split and stacked, for a promise of seed in the spring, we will all eat. A stunned silence fell. Then, someone at the back of the crowd, a farmer who had laughed the loudest at her, started to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, then it was joined by another and another, until the air was filled with it. Silas Croft stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, not by greed, but by generosity. He had lost his kingdom for the price of a dozen eggs. The winter that followed was hard, but it was not devastating. It was a winter of cooperation, fueled by protein and hope. Elara's farm became the heart of Promise Creek. Every morning, a line formed at her gate, not of beggars, but of partners. Men who had once mocked her now came to offer their labor, repairing her barn, digging a new well, and reinforcing the chicken coops until they were the sturdiest structures in the valley. Women brought their mending skills, their knowledge of preserving, and whatever they had managed to salvage from their root cellars. The currency of the town was no longer just coin, but work and trust. Elara's arithmetic became the town's arithmetic. So many eggs a day, so many mouths to feed, so many hands to work. Finn became her official clerk, keeping a careful ledger of the trades, his boyish scrawl recording the transactions that were saving them all. He guarded the coops at night, not because Elara asked him to, but because he saw it as his sacred duty. It was he who caught Silas Croft one moonless night, trying to pry the lock on the main coop, his greed having finally curdled into common theft. There was no trial. The town simply turned its back on him. His store remained closed, his fine horse was sold for feed, and he became a ghost in the community he had sought to rule. His shame was a far greater punishment than any jail cell. Elara, the madwoman, the fool, had become their leader. She never raised her voice, never gave a command. She simply met each day with the same steady, practical resolve she had always possessed. She had learned to speak the language of the land, and now she was teaching her neighbors. They learned that value is not always visible. They learned that a crisis can be an opportunity, and that a community is only as strong as its willingness to share. By the third week of the crisis, she had named a price for her eggs that was fair. By the end of the winter, her generosity had become the town's ethos. When spring finally came, it felt like a collective miracle. The rains returned, soft and steady, washing the grime of the swarm from the land. The hillsides sprouted a tentative fuzz of green. The town, leaner and tougher, began to plant again, using seed that had been bought with credit from a distant town, credit guaranteed by a new community leader, Elara. One warm afternoon, she stood with Old Man Hemlock by the fence line, looking out at her land. The field that had been stripped bare was now covered in a rich carpet of clover, seeded and fertilized by the chickens themselves. The flock, larger now with a new generation of chicks, ranged across it, fat and content. "The land always gives something back," Hemlock said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. He was not repeating a worn aphorism, he was stating a proven truth. You just have to learn what it wants to give. Elara watched Finn teaching a group of younger children how to identify the different hens. The general strutted among them, a small feathered king of his prosperous domain. She was no longer one person alone. She was the center of a wheel, and the spokes of community, work, and trust radiated out from her. The town had called her a fool for buying 200 chickens. They had not understood. She had not bought 200 mouths to feed. She had bought 200 small, feathered hearts to see them through the dark.